Hi, Jodi Daniels here. I'm a certified privacy professional and I help provide practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies. I've worked with companies like Deloitte, the Home Depot, Bank of America, and Cox Enterprises.
Hello, I'm Justin Daniels, the cyber side of the house. I'm a subject matter expert in cybersecurity, and I'm also a business attorney, and I'm also a cyber QB, and I help clients design, manage, and implement cyber plans. I also help them manage and recover from data breaches.
This episode is brought to you by Red Clover Advisors. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they can grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, SaaS, e commerce, media agencies, professional services, and financial services. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there is greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more, go to redcloveradvisors.com or email us at info@redcloveradvisors.com.
All right. And so, with that, I want to introduce our guest today. We have Mark Sangster, and he's here from eSentire, and he is the author of the book No Safe Harbor: The Inside Truth About Cybercrime and How to Protect Your Business. He is an award-winning speaker at international conferences and prestigious stages, including the Harvard Law School and the RSA Conference. His thought-provoking work and perspective on shifting risk trends has influenced industry thought leaders, and he's a go-to subject matter expert for leading publications and media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, when covering major data breach events. Mark, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And it's great to see you. We've had so many great collaborations in the last 6 months, and we've had a lot of fun together. So I want to open it up by just asking you a question, because we're going to talk a lot about your book today, and just give us a general sense. How did you get started in cybersecurity?
Too many decades ago, and I won't give you an exact number. I started working in the tech field and quickly ended up in companies like Cisco and Intel. And at one point, if we all remember those phones, Blackberries, and in fact, I worked on a project which was one of the first secure devices that they were building actually for the Pentagon. And the defense groups and contractors and so on. So it was by our standards today. I think we would consider it to be ridiculous, but at the time it was cutting edge, and that really was the start. And then here, most recently with eSentire, I'd worked at Intel and some other companies in related spaces, and then here, and I think the big thing for me was the fact that we have these clients in these different industries, and realizing what's happening to them, and the simple fact that in many cases they don't understand that they're a target. They don't understand what the consequences look like, and of course, you dealing with the data breach, post-event type of work that you do, you fully understand what that entire journey, and painful process looks like. And frankly, they don't, and they're unprepared. So that's sort of been my mission in these last few years, is to try and get that word out so that they understand the risk, and then help them put plans in place to mitigate those risks.
So, Mark, what do you think is the big holdup? What is it that companies are thinking? Why don't they get it?
So I think a lot of companies, like I've sort of, kind of hinted at it there, right? It's the first thing is that many of the smaller, mid-sized types of firms, so not the big banks and the insurance companies and so on, they don't see themselves as targets, and I think that's simply down to the demographic of what's represented in mainstream media, right? So they read about the big breaches like Capital One or TravelX or Marriott hotels and so on, and what they don't hear about is the small family-run manufacturing business in the Midwest, or the law firm of 150 attorneys, or the small medical facilities that get hit and shut down, not the big ones, not these, the major kind of conglomerates that we know about, that we will read about, like one, a couple of weeks ago. And for that reason, I think that the real problem here is it's ignorance, right? That they don't understand there's a problem. And unfortunately, ignorance is not bliss. In some cases, it can be negligence, right? And then when it comes to doing something about it, there's a real break, I think, between the ones and zeros of IT and the dollar signs in the sense of the board and the exec. So finding a common language or vernacular that they can use to discuss it, right? To talk in terms of risk, not in terms of, budget and, sort of that kind of, where we skip understanding what problem we're really trying to solve and we go straight to solutions. So it's like, well, buy a firewall, buy antivirus, get another box that blinks and supposedly does things for me, versus truly understanding what problem they're trying to solve and having that ability to sit around the boardroom and collaborate.
Well, kind of following up on Jodi's question and talking to your book a little bit, Mark. So what are you think some of the key takeaways from your book are? Why do I want to pick up and read your book? What will I learn in it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? I think as I've said here, part of the mission in this book was actually to get the word out, right? To either an anonymous way or the stories that have become public but not mainstream, to kind of tell those stories and not to blame, not to say, they made a mistake or they screwed up or whatever it is, but to learn those lessons, because in cybersecurity, that's part of it, right? Is we don't have a kind of a public mechanism of continued improvement, right? Where we, like if you think about airline safety as an example, you have the National Transport and Safety Board that comes in and does an investigation, determines all the factors, makes recommendations, and then the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, mandates those, right? And all the players, airlines, manufacturers, et cetera, all have to abide by those rules. And doing that, they continuously improve. And I think that's one of the takeaways from the book, is creating, partly to create that kind of mechanism within your own company. So to understand what's happening if something's occurred, to seek forward accountability, right? To look at, what happened, not who's to blame, and to put a simple framework together. And through the various chapters in the book, I look at those different aspects. So things like board and executive reporting. I look at understanding what root causes of events are, insurance, and what's insurance going to cover and what's it not going to cover, to try and create a simple framework for those mid-sized firms that don't have the wherewithal of these big banks when it comes to defending themselves.
So something comes to mind, which is, all too often people think about security. That's the IT person's job, or maybe if they're lucky, they have a CISO or someone responsible for it. You talk about board and executive level reporting, though. So who should be responsible in paying attention to these needs, and kind of, who's a core reader for what you've put together here?
Yeah, so the book is it's non-technical. I mean, a technical practitioner, and I've certainly had many, have read it and reviewed it and so on. But it is more the business leader, right? That's who I'm trying to get across, to say, this is a responsibility of yours, right? Just like any other aspect of fiduciary care, you have to do the same thing when it comes to the risks that are represented through cybersecurity issues, right? And so really it's helping them understand that, right? Those basics, like having the awareness, being able to measure that risk, to know the obligations that come through their business, through the assets that they hold. You would understand this as a privacy officer, right? Is the, what if you've got, protected non-public or and other ways like medical records, and those are in your, under your control. Well, then you have an obligation, responsibilities that come with that. So understanding what those look like, and then also putting the right plans in place. So it's, it's about alignment. So from a who should be doing this? Yeah, ultimately there should be an executive who is responsibility for security. They should have a seat at that table, and it shouldn't be the kind of the person who greets you at the door, takes your order, cooks your food, clears your plates away, and brings you the bill. Like, you can't have that person who's running all those tasks. You need one person who is responsible. So it falls. We see this a lot of times. It's the CIO, the information officer, or in financial institutions, sometimes it's a risk officer, a compliance officer. And privacy, security, you guys are perfect sitting here, right? Privacy, security, and compliance, they're like the three sisters, and they overlap on a Venn diagram, but there's not 100% coverage between the three, right? There are subtle differences, and that's where I think it's important to have somebody who understands the security element, and they should be balanced with the person who understands, let's say, the legal issues, right? So your general counsel or whoever it might be that provides that sort of risk assessment to say, okay, here's what our obligations look like, and can determine whether or not the framework that the security team puts together, meets that test.
So, Mark, one of the things that I find interesting when we talk about cybersecurity are talking about some of the stories behind it. And I know that one of the key aspects of your book is you put it into a real world context and you tell some great stories to prove some points. Is there any anecdote of a particular story in the book that you think will resonate with the audience? And could you share that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of tell two different sets of stories, right? The ones are the non-security ones. Like I talk about an airline accident. I talk about the Deepwater Horizon to look at things like supply chain risk, and another story about the Citicorp Tower in New York, which is the sort of the disaster that never occurred but might have, and was a secret for decades. And the reason to do that is to get out of the trees to see the forest, right? When we take it out of that context, it gives us a better chance to look at what some of the what were some of the findings, what are some of those recommendations or the lessons we can learn from that, because we're doing it in a framework, in fact, that doesn't have any kind of emotional bias to it, right? It's not about budgets or who has the authority in the company and so on. But in the cybersecurity space, yeah, I talk about lots of different stories, and and there's ones like this would be very relevant to now with the with COVID and working from home, is a story about a hedge fund in New York that years ago was opening a new office in Midtown Manhattan. The spouse of the managing partner was buying artwork. Their email account was unfortunately their credentials were harvested in a fake Wi-Fi spoof. So this is where we all know this with our iPhones or your Android phones. You walk into a Starbucks and you've already been on Starbucks public Wi-Fi. So if your phone is set to do so, it just automatically reconnects. Well, often you can buy not often, you can buy a little box for about $100 that effectively will spoof that Wi-Fi that has a stronger signal, so your phone will go onto that one. And then once you're on that device, they're effectively scooping and monitoring everything you're doing. And if it's it's not properly encrypted, as an example, they can read it. So anyway, they were able to get this individual's email. They had credentials for their bank account, their iTunes. When you get those suspicious emails from Google, for example, like your account's been accessed from a new device, you'll get that alert. They were catching those and deleting them within seconds so that she was never actually reading them. And what they discovered, and the reason they were doing this is, yeah, they could have defrauded her and, used some phishing campaigns based on, what they knew about her. But they knew she was buying this artwork. And so they went and they created a replica website. They figured out from her social media and her emails what art they were buying, what it was worth, and they started billing the hedge fund. The hedge fund paid out about $450,000 before they figured out what was happening, and that's where we came into the story, right? And then they brought us in, they brought me in, and we reverse engineered it and figured out what had happened. So some of the lessons here is it's not always a big bank where they're trying to steal money. There are other ways to monetize. Now, this is direct cash operation. This was, fraudulent wire transfers and fake invoicing. It also shows you the blend of understanding, your personal and your professional, the crossovers, and where some of these risks come from, right? Like, it wasn't just the managing partner who, from a security perspective, would likely be locked down, right? Proper passwords and multi-factor authentication and all that goodness, partridge in a pear tree on their device and on their systems at work. But the actual risk and the vulnerability came through a family member. And we've seen other times like this where kids play on a computer, as an example. And in doing so, it downloads whatever malware that then later on detonates when they take that, that laptop or whatever that device is, and they go back into their work environment. So it's trying to help them understand what the targeting, the risks look like, but also how kind of well engineered these things are, right? That they know what they know how to go after you. They build elaborate schemes. I really want people to understand that it's not, Skynet, that delivers, Terminators and they go off and they lock one laptop, that they're a lot more clever than this, that there's a bad guy, there's another human at the other end of this equation who is actually, is consciously maneuvering, right? Is deploying malware, is moving around your network, is looking for the best opportunities through which they can, generate their revenue, right? Robbing you effectively, or stealing information to resell, and understanding that. So you understand it's a complex thing. It's not something you go buy a box and, like I said, you plug in a firewall and you think you're safe. That's locking your windows and your doors. But we know houses still get broken into.
So, Mark, listening to your story about the breaking into her Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
It seems to me a key takeaway from that story that might be generally applicable is for that hedge fund, the security perimeter is now the hedge fund's wife's
Yeah.
cell phone. And that asset isn't owned by the company, but it has significant consequences if there's a breach of that non-company asset that directly impacts the company. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's absolutely, I think, the biggest problem that we have right now, in particular with a mass drive to remote workers, is that most companies, and this is another issue, had sort of predicated their security programs on the notion of a physical perimeter, right? This, like, take your traditional bank. You've got bricks and mortar, you've got doors that are locked and security guards and a vault, and a passcode for that vault, and it only opens so many hours and all that kind of thing, right? And it's all this notion of keeping people out. And what they don't understand is there isn't a perimeter anymore, right? That has dissolved, or there's an infinite number of perimeters. Take your, I think you get to the same place. It's just a different, different approach. And that's the risk now. So we are blending more and more personal and professional technologies and roles and responsibilities. So, for example, in this case, you're right. You had the managing partner's spouse and their phone. Now, with remote, the remote workforce that we see, you have home routers as an example, right? That have been provided by your ISP, that have default settings on them, and most people don't know what they need to do to secure those, right? Like putting a password on their Wi-Fi and encrypting the Wi-Fi and changing the username and the password for the administrative account on it so that other people can't go in and make modifications to it. They don't know that stuff, right? And nor, to some degree, I would say, should they. But now we have to get to this point where we are starting to downdraft some of that expertise, and we have to do that, right? So companies have to reframe the way they protect those mobile devices, and there's technology that helps with that. But then B, it's also expanding the way that they manage awareness training to not just go from like, look, don't click on a link when you see something suspicious, to, is your router at home configured? When you use your device, what are you doing? Like, how do we secure, your personal device that has access to corporate assets? And that's become the norm. I said a joke. We used to, in the industry, they called it BYOD, or bring your own device, which was very, of course, alluring to companies because they weren't buying all these phones. People were supplying them anyway. The downside, of course, is now you have that blurring of, well, what's corporate, what's personal, and what rights does the corporation have when it comes to, manipulating that device. And now we go to bring your own home, BYOH, where it gets even more blurred. I can't imagine what would happen in a case where, let's say, for example, you need to secure forensics information after a breach, and it's on somebody's home computer, or it's on somebody's, there's a script on the router, right? Are they necessarily going to say, yeah, no problem, I'm going to hand that over to you? Or are they going to refuse to, effectively, provide that support because it's an invasion of their privacy? And I don't use that term legally. You guys would know better than I.
Yeah. No, I think that'll make sense. It's interesting because in my world, I'm really making sure that companies are aware of the different privacy laws, and in those, there's implications if you have a data breach and an issue within them. But at the same time, some people are kind of right. Well, I'll just deal with the law when I need to, right? When I'm required.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you. Where's the pivoting point for some of these companies to realize, especially in this environment now, I have this BYO, bring your own home, OH,
yep.
right? And if I have that scenario, and it's not only BYOD and such a trend to more remote work, where's that pivoting point that you're starting to see companies realize, okay, this scenario that you've just described, that could happen to me?
Yeah, unfortunately, in many of the cases, I'd say at least more than half of them, probably pushing towards, 2/3 of them, is they have an event, right? And that doesn't always mean it's a significant breach. It may be a material incident, or it's a close enough brush, right, with that badness that's the wake up call. So unfortunately, all too often, and I kind of use this, I use this comparison in the book where I talk about, they have to touch the stove to figure out that it's hot, and they get burned before they learn. Or the other where I do see a pivoting now, and I think this is becoming more of the norm, is that you have pressure through your relationships and your supply chain. So like when I talk about what assets you have and what obligations come along with those, we are seeing that organizations that are part of some kind of chain of production or services, then is sort of pulled along by by the bigger parties in that group. So a simple example would be many law firms went through significant due diligence work when it came to contract renewals with major banks and financial institutions, because of course they're heavily regulated. And as those regulations changed, like in New York with the Department of Financial Services a couple of years ago, they went through that downdrafting, right? So suddenly those questions that were being asked by the regulator were literally getting thrown in an Excel spreadsheet and emailed out to the firm saying, we want to retain your services, but you have to answer all this stuff. And certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen a mass change where I think at first it was completely new and they didn't know what the heck to do, to then it became, okay, we're being overwhelmed by this stuff, and now they're at a point where they've got ways of managing those kind of DDQ type requests. But that's the other big piece. But a lot of companies haven't figured it out. And I think the other thing that happens is we have these times where things shift significantly. So I've talked about in if we use New York, right, 9/11 back 2001, and that really shifted the mindset around security or business continuity and operations. But the focus was on the primary facility, right? Okay, well, what happens if the building is not available, right? Or the networks and the systems within it, and okay, just let's hope it's not a terrorist attack, but it could be a flood or it could be a power failure. So they put everything on the other side of the river, right, in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they had all their backups there. And then, a little over a decade later, Hurricane Sandy in 2012 rolls up the coast, floods out Manhattan, floods out New Jersey. And it turns out that wasn't good enough, right? That geographically it wasn't far enough apart. And even the ABA came out in their cybersecurity framework and said, this is a new test, right? That Hurricane Sandy will become the new standard for business continuity. So are you geographically separate enough? Have you thought about having hot swapping and failovers and so on, so you don't lose these systems? And I think COVID, is the same thing now, right? Where we're seeing another one of these factors in 2020 where it's made us rethink the way we look at security. And now I think we live in a virtual world, right? We have, assets in the cloud, we have distributed workforces, and we have distributed controls and models and mechanisms. So it is, you don't have to be in a building, you don't have to be in a factory floor in a lot of these cases. So this is another one of those moments where we have to rethink security and realign to that model. And I think the other place I've actually seen this just recently talking about this is insurance, where it's making sure that what is part of your network, what is protected under that insurance clause, that contract. Do some of these personal devices fall outside that? So if something happens with those devices, are you covered, right? Or if that's the cause, maybe that negates that coverage.
Yeah, I know Justin's so excited and has lots of questions, but I have a follow-up, so I'm gonna jump in. I'm so glad that you brought up the supply chain, because I see that all the time. From a privacy standpoint, I often get people calling and realizing that they have to take their privacy program or security program up a level, or even pay attention, especially on the privacy side, because they've gotten a contract that says, I won't do business with you until you get this in order, until you can show me you're complying with GDPR, or until you can agree to these security terms. And so all these will come across my desk, and someone's going to say, can I agree to this? Or I need your help. We have this big deal and I can't close it until we're able to say, yes, we've checked the box on those things. So I'm so glad to hear that you're seeing something really similar.
Yeah, supply chain, I think, is actually one of the biggest areas of risk now. And conversely, on the other side, it is one of the biggest drivers of improved standards, right? So, certainly in manufacturing right now, that's a massive area of, I'd almost call it panic, where they have what they're calling their fourth, the fourth generation industrial revolution, effectively, which is the fully connected, internet connected devices for remote management. Somebody sitting in an office in Houston is remotely controlling whatever it is, manufacturing processes out in an oil rig sitting out in the Gulf of Mexico, as an example, right? So that's really shifted. And yeah, supply chain, I think, I think the privacy laws also really drove a focus on supply chain. I mean, GDPR is a great example, right? Where you have the notion of controller and processor, whatever, right? Where you really have to understand what that looks like and where you fit and why are you doing this. And it all really comes back to, I think, with companies is often a lot of the times with supply chain, I think it's a want, not a need. So, getting that consensus in the organization, understanding why you're doing it in the first place. So putting those gates in, like, what's the business case, right? Why is it we want to outsource this? Not to say we shouldn't, but if this is the best means, let's make sure we looked at our options. Now that we've done that, how do we assess risk? So, that would be conducting due diligence, looking at where you think the gaps or the vulnerabilities are, and then again, putting something in place, right? Establishing minimum security standards as an example throughout that supply chain. And then, of course, in the event that something occurs, having, one, clearly having defined things like roles and responsibilities, and then also notifications. So I've, a lot of times say, like, make yourself a mini GDPR, like, could you ask for 72 hours notice, or here, specifically define the things you want to know about. You don't want to hear about some of the nuisance stuff, but you might want to know about some of the more specific things, right? I sort of joke, right? If if your spidey senses start tingling, then, I want to know about it until we normalize and figure out what needs to be reported and what's noise and what's signal. So I think some of the privacy laws in the last couple of years, actually, like, what was it, 2018, I guess, with GDPR, has really, I think, opened the eyes of a lot of companies. But even then, I found for a while, a lot of companies didn't think that it applied, right? Until they realized, based on their
I totally think
constituency,
it
that it did.
applies.
Yeah, yeah.
So wait a minute here, team. I'm going to pile on with this topic, but I want to put it in a different context. So both of you were just talking about how third-party supply chain can play a significant role for companies having to care more about security and obviously privacy. So let's take that into the context of an M&A deal. And what I typically see in the context of an M&A deal is they're trying to do due diligence on the seller. And now you're saying, wait a second, I'm going to go and have to do due diligence on the top 10 suppliers of that seller, because obviously that's a big vector of vulnerability, as we've just discussed. But then how do you tell the financial people who are in charge of the deal that, oh, wait a second, guys, I may have to disrupt your cadence on the deal because we need to do this additional due diligence?
I think you're highlighting a major problem, right? Which is exactly that they don't. That's, I think, one of the biggest issues we do see in supply chain is that the business side often drives the need and the relationship, the fulfillment, and then its security kind of gets chucked in after the fact. It's like, oh yeah, we signed with this company, they're going to supply whatever it is, and that's fantastic, but I know you guys have some checklists you need to go through. And it is very much an afterthought. And in M&A, you are absolutely right. I mean, let's be realistic about this. They are not going to stop $1 billion deal because they think there might be some security concerns, right? They're going to look at that and be like, yeah, we'll figure that out after the fact. And that's certainly an issue that I've personally witnessed, where I did work with a manufacturing firm, food supply, and their security, hygiene, and posture was quite good. In fact, I'd say it was actually fairly advanced by many standards. That said, most of the growth in the business came from acquisition, right? So, their food supply. So they're going out and buying, like, automated farms and smaller grower operations and so on. And those, like, did not, their security is a 2 out of 10, right? Or a 1 out of 10. It's almost oblivious compared to the mothership. And so then there's that risk that introduces. And, that's what we saw with them, was that it was look, you're not stopping these deals because, time is money, and, we're here to make money, and these people grow chickens or corn or whatever it is we need. And, that's key to getting into a specific market or a geo. And so they do it. And then the consequences come on afterwards. So that's where they were trying to look to us to say, okay, what can you do in I don't even call it temporary fashion, but, there's almost like a quick triage, a quick support, where you're going to monitor these smaller companies until we get them back up to our standard, right? And then we'll kind of roll them in-house, because they saw that as a significant risk.
Because, Mark, I'm going to relate this comment back to what you said earlier in your story from your book about the managing partner's wife for the hedge fund.
Yeah.
So let's say you've hacked her phone in the way that you've described. but instead you're now able to get a window into what investments the hedge fund is
Oh,
making. Maybe you then go intrude that company. Can you talk a little bit about why most times it's not like we go and intrude into a system and all of a sudden we're going to engage in mayhem? We're going to do what? We're going to stop and wait. So I was hoping you could like elaborate a little bit on that using that other example.
yeah. So I can, yeah, and I can use a parallel one. So you're right. When it comes to cyber attacks, we're used to, I think, the big ones that we see now are the operational disruption plays, right? That's the, we deploy ransomware throughout the organization, we shut you down, we ask for a whole lot of money to let you start up again, right? And often those become public. But there are the sort of secondary kind of acts, like what you're referring to. So, if we go back, 5-6 years now, there were two major law firms on Wall Street that were hacked, and it was the same thing. They weren't going for the basic, like, look, let's get funds out of escrow accounts as an example, or managed accounts. It was the theft of what we consider almost innocuous kind of information, marketing reports, press releases. And the reason they were doing that is they were looking at those firms were involved in managing investment portfolios. And on the other side of the river, again, you had biotech firms. And so they were doing things like looking at FDA reports, and then they were front running trades. So in those cases, you could think of the example from the pharma industry that I worked in, would be that they have a new allergy pill that they're coming out in a delivery mechanism for children, right? So the normal drug, or the parent drug, has been approved for adult use, but now they've gone through whatever new testing for pediatric application, and that's great. Well, if that drug got approval from the FDA or passed whatever initial tests, their stock is going to go up on Monday. However, if that drug fails the test, their stock's going to crash on Monday. So knowing that information, you can effectively front run, right? Run those trades. It's insider trading, and you're absolutely right. You have access to non-public information that you have used to gain a profit on a public market, right? The SEC doesn't like that kind of stuff, and they come after you. Now, in the story of those two Wall Street law firms, they did charge 3 Chinese military officers with the crime, but good luck, because I doubt they're showing up in Lower Manhattan to be arraigned, right? But anyway, it shows that that's a great example, and you raise a good point, which is you yourself, as part of a supply chain, may not actually be the intended target, but you either have access to information or you're a back door into that target organization or whatever it might be. And yes, it's not always an immediate smash and grab, like, oh, look, I've sent you some fake invoices because I see you have some clients with a bunch of money sitting in an account. It's more of the information I steal from you then later on gets used in a larger crime, and it's highly profitable. Like in that case, I think they figured that the bad guys made, like, I think it was $9 million in one trade, which is not a bad day's work.
No, pretty good.
I'm laughing when you said Target, because how did Target get hacked?
That's right, their HVAC vendor, right?
Their supply chain.
Their supply chain. That's right. And in that one, I mean, there's even more issues in that one, because of course there was a lot of talk about how it was actually flagged, right? That it was noticed, because that one, and again, I'm not trying to point fingers here, but there would be forensics information. So for example, if you have telemetry going back and forth between your head office and the HVAC system, as an example, you can baseline the level of traffic you're seeing, right? So it kind of normalizes, and you're like, okay, it looks like this. When you start to see massive spikes, right, where you've got huge pockets of data, like all the credit card information that's being exfiltrated, those kind of things are indicators of compromise, right? That's where you start to go, wait a minute, what's going on? And you need to check with that vendor to say, hey, are you doing something different? Maybe you're, I don't know, uploading a whole bunch of localized data that you need to pull, and you only do that on an annual basis or a semi-annual basis, but finding out what's going on, because often those oddball behaviors are a good indicator that something nefarious is happening.
Great, thanks. Jodi, you want to take us home?
Yeah. So, Mark, you've shared a lot of information that I think is incredibly valuable. And if you needed to or if you could, distill it down and share with us something that you do in your personal life. So share a privacy or security tip that you use every day in your life. It might be hard to pick. You probably have a lot in your book to pick.
No, that's a good question. So, a simple one, I think, is things like password hygiene and not sharing passwords across various systems, right? And I use different sort of sets of passwords depending on the kind of the risk, right? So I tend to try and avoid signing up for things in stores. Can I get your email so we can send you something? Because that's just the stuff that gets, that gets stolen easily, and then they use that to phish you. But when it comes to things where credit cards are attached, so online retailer, Google Play or iCloud or things like that, I use more sophisticated passwords, and I also don't share them. So I know my kids are atrocious at this, so I have a guest Wi-Fi, right? And I have a common password for that, which doesn't have anything to do with anything else. So their friends show up, they're on that Wi-Fi. I'm not giving them the core password, because then that's where I worry that they're kind of they get into our network. So it's it's basic things, right? And even that changed slightly recently. So we always used to say change your password frequently. Now NIST, as an example, is recommending that you don't do that, but you come up with a longer chain that you can remember, that's easy to remember, like a line from a song or a movie or something, because then there's less risk in you actually using that. That's harder for it to be brute force hacked than it is you constantly changing and writing it down, and leaving evidence in other ways that can be captured. Or the classic is having the spreadsheet called passwords that then has all your passwords in it. And I know it's like you laugh, but it's more common than you think.
Jodi's gonna have a new password phrase. It's called "I love the Steelers."
Yeah. That'll never be.
So, hey, last question we wanted to ask you, just on a personal note. Mark, can you tell us about your favorite hobby besides writing really cool cybersecurity books?
Yeah, so I love hiking is a big one for me. So I guess with some of the travel restrictions, it hasn't been as fun, and mostly I prefer more hilly desert kind of climbs. So going to Arizona and New Mexico and places like that, and going up and down rocks is my sort of free time being out there. I don't know, they call it like tree bathing or something, but just that idea, right? Like I just love getting out in the wild and standing up on a hill somewhere, and feeling the dirt on your boots is a way of really transitioning from the day-to-day world that we live in.
Outdoor. What is your favorite saying?
They're the best place to be.
West is
It's
best.
the best. That's right.
West is best. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Tell everyone how they can grab a copy of the book and how they can contact you with any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So book No Safe Harbor, it actually drops October 22nd. So just over a week away today, which is fantastic. You can pre-order it now on all of your popular resellers like Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and so on. And if you'd like more information or you have any questions, go to MB as in Bob Sangster. It's not for Bob, but mbsangster.com. And I have contact information there and more on the book. And you can even get some, I think there's some sneak peek and preview kind of information there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Justin, anything else you want to add?
Nope, it's been a great session, and as always, great to have you in the house, Mark.
Yeah, thanks again. Yeah, I love collaborating, and it's always a great way to sort of look at the different aspects of cybersecurity and privacy and so on. So again, thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. Thank you.